I'm Chance Dorland, and this is the Spurs Insider, our weekly NBA podcast from expressnews.com. And now 2 weeks in a row, a special three-way discussion episode with San Antonio Express News sports writers Jeff McDonald, Mike Finger, and myself. Last week, gentlemen, we talked about that first big event of the new season, Media Day with the San Antonio Spurs. Obviously, moving past that, we're going to take a look at several different topics today, and we're starting off with something that I believe you recently wrote about, Jeff, talking about rebuilding that defense after the loss of a bunch of substantial defensive players from the last year. Obviously, we've lost quite a lot from this last season.
Yeah, the Spurs have always, for as long as Greg Popovich has been around, defense has been sort of the backbone of what they do. And, it worked in part because they have such a great defensive system, and preach that, but also because they've had great defensive players. I think in 19 of the last 21 seasons, they've had a player on the NBA's all-defensive team. They lost a lot of defensive talent, though, this offseason. From a unit that was fourth in the league last year. They lost Kawhi Leonard, who was a two-time defensive player of the year. Now, Kawhi only played 9 games last year, so he almost doesn't count when you're doing that math. But they also lost Danny Green, who's been on the all-defensive team. And they lost Kyle Anderson, who showed himself to be a really underrated defender last year. So, the question of can the Spurs and the players they replaced him with are not players that are typically known for their defense. DeMar DeRozan has typically graded out as a minus defender in his career. He's a great scorer, but he's not a guy that's really known for his defense. So, and he's going to be guarding on one wing. Rudy Gay's on the other side. He's another guy that's in the same boat, not really known as a defensive guy. So to me, a lot of this season is going to hinge on, is it Greg Popovich's defensive system made the Spurs so great defensively over the years, or is it having great defensive players? And I think we're going to find it's probably a little from column A and a little from column B.
It'll be interesting to see how Pop shuffles the guys who, let's be honest, aren't going to be all defensive type players no matter what he does. I mean, there are some guys who will hustle and give you effort on that end, but just like, I'm not sure how you can play a lineup with, say, Patty Mills and DeMar DeRozan and like Marco Bellinelli all at the same time. All of those guys probably will give you some effort, but these are not the Kawhi Leonard, Kyle Anderson, Danny Green type stoppers. So, part of the challenge of putting together a lineup and putting together a rotation, I think, for Popovich and his staff will be to kind of make sure that there aren't too many of those liabilities on the floor at the same time. And like Jeff was talking about, with the DeMar DeRozan, we'll find out whether Popovich really is this defensive guru who can make anybody a good defender. DeMar DeRozan probably will be a better defender this year than he has been in his past with Toronto just because of the Spurs system. It's not going to be a miracle working system, though, where he all of a sudden becomes, what Danny Green or Kawhi Leonard was. So there's a lot of factors that go into this. Part of it is individual improvement from each of these guys to be a better defender than they were before. But I think there's a kind of an onus on the staff to make sure that there's never too many liabilities on the floor at the same time.
Now, this has come up on the podcast before, also the term corporate knowledge. Would either of you two care to kind of expand on that? What exactly does that mean?
Well, I mean, for years, Pop thought that one of Tony Parker's biggest strengths was being able to have him out on the floor and just have a guy who is able, when they bring in new players, just to know what's expected in any situation. And that was true of Manu Ginobili. That was true of Tim. It's even true of guys like Patty Mills now. But I think that if the Spurs have an advantage or had an advantage over the rest of the league the last couple of years, it's that they had so many guys who had this stuff ingrained in their DNA because they've been around so long. That's just not going to be the case anymore. Patty is the only guy left from the last championship, and it's natural. Every NBA team goes through turnover. The Spurs were the fortunate one that had the same guys for more than 10 years. And now it's, NBA reality is kind of catching up with them, that they're going to go through what everybody else does and having to teach their system to new guys. And, it'll be interesting to see how that works out.
When it was Duncan, Parker, Ginobili together for all those years, by the end, a lot of times they'd call a basic set, but a lot of it was just Tim gives me this look and I know to go back door. And it's all based on body language and muscle memory and just knowing the look on the guy's face, what he wants. And that just comes from playing with each other for 15 years. And that often was the Spurs' big advantage, is because you couldn't really plan to defend that, because it was, I don't want to say improvised, but some of it kind of was. And a lot of that is the same defensively. We don't see it as much as lay people, but a lot of that corporate knowledge and chemistry is lost on defense as well, when you have guys on that end that haven't played together a lot and don't have that same kind of chemistry.
I mean, as recently as a couple of years ago, Danny Green was still kind of the new guy, and he'd been around for 5-6 years. When you have guys who have been around for years that are still new, it's good for chemistry as a whole, and what Jeff's talking about in terms of being able to play by looking at a guy or knowing where a guy's going to cut. And now the new guys are really young and have not been here at all. And it's like we said earlier, it's going to be fascinating to watch.
Fascinating to watch. That kind of leads me into my next tiny question before we move on to an entirely new topic. Either of you two, what do you do in this situation? Do you just have this be a strong rebuilding year, and maybe you don't tell that to people because it's not great to hear, but that's the case? Or do you try something different with a different group of players and see what happens?
Rebuilding is a tricky word, because first of all, the Spurs have never really rebuilt in their history. It's amazing to look at how seldom this team has ever been bad and has had to go through those fallow periods. I mean, this is a team that's gone from George Gervin to David Robinson to Tim Duncan to Kawhi Leonard, basically. And so this franchise, as a rule, does not tear it down to build it back up again. And if they wanted to do that, I don't think you trade for DeMar DeRozan. I think you go for draft picks or go really young. I think as I've written, as Jeff has written, this is a franchise kind of trying to thread the needle between, as you said, Chance, rebuilding and also is trying to stay competitive. And does anybody think they're going to compete for an NBA championship this year? Probably not. But if you ask Greg Popovich, if you ask LaMarcus Aldridge, if you ask DeMar DeRozan, this isn't a team that's all about trying to put something new together for the years ahead. I think this team wants to win as many games as it can this year, whether that's 45 or 50 or 55, what have you. And, that can be tough to do when you're in the same conference as Golden State and Houston and on down the line. But I would not say that the Spurs go into this thinking they're rebuilding. If anything, as LaMarcus said at Media Day, the rebuilding was last year when they had to learn how to live without Kawhi.
So a few names that you just mentioned there: DeMar DeRozan, LaMarcus Aldridge. What's that relationship going to look like? How are they going to fit together?
Yeah, I don't know how that's going to look on the court, because LaMarcus Aldridge had such a good year last year offensively when Kawhi Leonard was hurt, and LaMarcus had to and got to be the guy through whom the entire offense ran. And he had a breakout season after his first 2 seasons in San Antonio were not that were good, but I would say good but not great playing next to Kawhi. He never really found his niche playing next to a scorer like Kawhi. And now it almost seems like on the offensive end, they're going to have to find a way to have LaMarcus Aldridge coexist with another guy who's going to take a lot of touches and a lot of shots, and should, because he's one of the premier scorers in the league and has been for the last 5 or 6 years in DeMar DeRozan.
It was quite the question last year, and I'm not sure we ever had an answer that everybody agreed on as to whether the LaMarcus Aldridge resurgence was all about Pop telling him to be him, which I think played a big role in it, and also Kawhi being out. And I would like to believe that LaMarcus would have had a better year even if Kawhi had played all year, but we can't completely discount the idea that the reason why he looked so much more confident on offense and was so much more effective on offense in terms of being a scorer is because he was the primary guy. So going back to the question that brought this up, does bringing in a guy who has scored 20 points a game for his whole career, basically, does that mean that LaMarcus moves into a secondary role, and does that affect his aggression and his confidence and all that stuff moving forward? We will find that out later this season, but we never got that answer last year. I think a lot of people were anticipating that answer to come when Kawhi returned to the court for good last year. He just never did. And so we're about to see whether LaMarcus really changed or whether it had all to do with what role he was in.
And they're not the same player, LaMarcus and DeRozan. They're not the same player, but they occupy a lot of the same geography on the court. They're both mid-range guys that are going to attack from the mid-range. Last year in the NBA, there were only 7 guys to attempt at least 1,000 two-pointers. LaMarcus Aldridge was one of those 7, and DeMar DeRozan was one of those 7. So now 2 of them now play on the Spurs. And this is a league that's sort of gone away from that. The efficient teams are the ones that attack from 3-pointers and layups. The mid-range is kind of no man's land now. And so it's kind of interesting. And the Spurs have been doing this for a few years now, kind of zigging where the rest of the league is zagging. And can you make enough two-pointers at an efficient enough clip to overcome maybe the getting outscored from 3-point land by the other team a lot of times?
One paradox that I've brought up, or what seems like a paradox I've brought up several times since this DeRozan trade, the Spurs traditionally have been at the forefront of analytics and studying numbers and trying to find the market inefficiencies and that they can exploit. I mean, they were ahead of the game on all that stuff. And analytics hates mid-range jumpers. So on the one hand, you have the team that should be the nerdiest, the most geekiest team ever in terms of studying what works and what doesn't. And they are embracing what the nerds and the geeks say does not work. So maybe they are ahead of the curve. And like Jeff said, they have discovered that there is something to be found there in the mid-range game because teams don't defend it anymore. Or they may have just been kind of stuck with it and to make the most of it because DeRozan was the guy available and Aldridge is their star, and they're just going to have to find a way to make it work. We'll see.
So we've been discussing a lot of the big names, DeMar DeRozan, LaMarcus Aldridge. However, obviously, a lot of younger players on the Spurs. They might be able to grab a bigger role after training camp, through training camp. Any non-DeRozan newcomers who might have big seasons coming up on the horizon in the minds of either of you two?
As far as young players, I mean, he's not really a newcomer, but Derek White. He was their first round pick last year. So in 2017, he spent most of last season in the G League developing. Didn't see a lot of time in the NBA, but he's the guy they're really high on. He's a guard, very versatile. He might be the guy that makes their second unit go. I mean, he's the guy that's going to create, score for others, and that second unit is just going to be sort of a frantic, frenetic kind of group. And I think that's will play to Derek White's strengths. He could be this year's version of Kyle Anderson, a guy that languished on the bench for a little while, wasn't really part of the every night rotation, but once he finally got that chance, became sort of indispensable. I think we might see that with White this year.
And on the subject of new guys, the new guy that came with DeMar DeRozan in that trade, Jakob Poeltl, am I getting that right? He is a guy who had lottery-type talent and is not going to fill up the box score with points and assists and everything that grabs a lot of headlines, but he could be a pretty decent complement to Pau Gasol in terms of doing the kinds of athletic things that Pau doesn't do anymore at that position. And if you need a really athletic guy to finish on the pick and rolls and to attack the rebound, attack the glass, I mean, this guy was not just a throw-in, I don't think. I think the Spurs asked for somebody other than DeMar DeRozan in this trade, and there's probably a reason why they asked for this guy. And yeah, maybe I'm giving them a little bit too much credit because of the luck they've had in the past finding these guys that other people don't want. But I wouldn't be surprised if he becomes a factor.
Yeah, Pirtle looked really good the other night. The Spurs have played one preseason game to this point, but in that one preseason game, he looked really good coming off the bench. And it looks to me like the plan for now is for him to be sort of the centerpiece, the center, the literal center of that second unit, and then surround him, let him do the dirty work around the rim, and then surround him with shooters and scorers and three-point gunners. And that second unit is going to be kind of an up and down unit with Jakob Pirtle doing a lot of the dirty work around the rim, rebounding, defending, in the rim on the other end, and that sort of thing.
And I think that's probably going to do it for today's episode, though we do have a few moments left. Jeff McDonald, Mike Finger, anything else we can discuss before we say goodbye?
I think we'll have more to discuss as the days and weeks go along. You got a couple more preseason games coming up this week. Home games against Detroit on Friday and the Houston Rockets on Sunday. So, with each game, we kind of see more of the team and how it looks and how the puzzle pieces are going together. I think with each game, we'll have more and more to talk about as we go along.
And Kawhi Leonard continuing to defend his laugh, I see. So looking forward to hearing more of that.
And thanks again to San Antonio Express News sports writers Jeff McDonald and Mike Finger for joining me for another free-for-all three-way conversation on today's episode of the Spurs Insider, our weekly NBA podcast from ExpressNews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.